The Queen Mother smiled at almost everyone, and the smile was the whole point of her. It was the warmth that seemed to cost her nothing, the gin and the horses and the laugh that came easily. The public face of a woman who had worked out early, that being adored is a kind of power, and that adoration holds best when it looks like an accident of temperament rather than the product of work. There was one person in her own family that the smile never quite reached. He had married her elder daughter in the autumn of 1947, taken his place one step behind a throne he would never sit on, and stood there for the next 54 years with a slowly hardening awareness that his wife's mother had filed him, somewhere in the first years, under the heading of a problem to be contained rather than a man to be loved. His name was Philip. He was sharp where she was soft, and restless where she was settled, an exiled prince with no money, no country, and a family history the British establishment found embarrassing, who had walked into the oldest institution in the country and discovered that the most beloved woman in it had already decided he did not belong. They shared a family for more than half a century. They buried the same king. They sat through the same endless official lunches, appeared in the same photographs season after season for decades, and almost nobody looking at those photographs would ever have guessed that behind the lavender and the careful courtesy ran one of the longest, most patiently managed Cold Wars the House of Windsor ever produced. If you are enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I love hearing from you. At the center of it stood the one person they both loved and both wanted, the single prize neither of them would ever surrender. Her name was Elizabeth. She was about to become queen, and the two people who loved her most were about to spend the rest of their lives competing, without ever raising their voices, for the right to shape what she became. The temptation with a story like this one is to resolve it into a simple word, and the word the title offers is despise. It is a strong word, and it is not quite the right one, and the gap between what it suggests and what was actually true is where the interesting part of the story lives. The Queen Mother did not hate Prince Philip in the way that people who are consumed by hatred hate. She was not capable of being consumed by anything. That was the first and most important thing about her, the quality that made her formidable, and the quality that made her, in this specific relationship, so difficult for him to fight. She did not lose her temper with him. She did not denounce him at her own dinner table, or refuse to be in rooms with him, or conduct any of the visible feuds that would have given a biographer something clean to point at. What she did was something more durable and more difficult to name. She assessed him, early, with the same clear and unsentimental eye she turned on everyone who came near the institution she had given her life to, and she found him to be the wrong kind of man for the thing he had married into, and having reached that judgment she spent the next 5 decades managing the consequences of his presence with a consistency that he could feel and could never quite prove. The smile stayed in place the entire time. The smile was always in place. That was how she did everything. To understand why she reached the judgment she reached, you have to understand what she was and what he was, because the two of them were not simply two people who happened not to get along. They were two complete and opposite theories of how power should work, placed inside the same family and pointed at the same target. She believed in the surface. She believed that a monarchy survives by managing what people see, by maintaining warmth and continuity, and the appearance of effortless grace over whatever complicated reality lies underneath. And she had spent her whole life perfecting the maintenance of that surface until the maintenance had become indistinguishable from her personality. He believed in the engine. He believed that an institution survives by working properly, by being efficient and modern and honest with itself about its own failings, by cutting the waste and reforming the rot and dragging the whole apparatus into whatever century it currently found itself in. She thought his approach was vulgar and dangerous, the instinct of a man who did not understand that the monarchy was not a business and could not be run like one. He thought her approach was sentimental and lazy, the instinct of a woman who had confused her own comfort with the good of the crown, and who surrounded herself with flatterers precisely so that nobody would ever tell her the difference. They were both, in their way, correct about each other. That was the part that made the feud so impossible to end. Neither of them was wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. She had been born Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon in the summer of 1900, the daughter of a Scottish earl, raised at Glamis Castle, in the particular world of the old landed aristocracy, a world that taught its daughters that class is performed rather than simply possessed, and that the management of other people's perceptions is the most important skill a woman of position can develop. She had married Prince Albert, the shy second son with the terrible stammer, in 1923, and she had watched him nearly broken by the institution before she helped him survive it. Then in 1936, her brother-in-law Edward had abandoned the throne for an American divorcee, and her stammering husband had been forced to become King George VI, and she had become queen in conditions that neither of them had wanted or planned for. By the time Philip arrived in her family's orbit, she had been at the very center of the British monarchy for more than a decade. She had run a wartime court, visited the bombed streets of the East End in her best clothes, refused to leave London during the Blitz, and built herself into something close to a national symbol of fortitude and grace. She was not a young woman learning the rules when she encountered Philip. She was the most accomplished practitioner of the monarchy's particular kind of power that the institution had produced in a generation, and she knew exactly what she was looking at when she looked at the penniless Greek prince her daughter had decided to marry. He had been born Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark in the summer of 1921, on a kitchen table on the island of Corfu, in a house with no electricity and no hot water, and the circumstances of his birth turned out to be a fair preview of the circumstances of his childhood. Within a year and a half, his family was driven out of Greece. His uncle, the king, had been forced to abdicate after a military disaster, and his father, Prince Andrew, had been arrested and put on trial, and came close enough to execution that the intervention of a British warship was required to get the family out of the country. The story that the infant Philip was carried away from Greece in a cot, improvised from a fruit crate, is the kind of detail that sounds invented, and is, in fact, true. He grew up with no fixed home and no real money, shuttled between relatives across Europe, a prince in title, and a refugee in practice. His mother, Princess Alice, was deaf and suffered a mental health crisis when he was a boy, and was placed in a sanatorium for a period of years during which she effectively vanished from his life. His father drifted away to the south of France and a life of casinos and decline, and died there in 1944, leaving his son almost nothing but a signet ring, some brushes, and a few personal effects. His 4 older sisters all married German princes, several of them with connections to the Nazi regime that would become, in 1947, a problem that the British establishment had no idea how to politely solve. He was raised, in the gaps left by his scattered parents, by his mother's English relatives, the family that had anglicized its German name of Battenberg into the smoother and more acceptable Mountbatten during the First World War. His uncle, Louis Mountbatten, the ambitious and brilliant and endlessly self-promoting figure known to the family as Dickie, became the closest thing he had to a guiding father, and that fact alone would shape Philip's standing with the Queen Mother before she had exchanged more than a few sentences with him. The detail of the German sisters deserves to be sat with, because it was not a minor awkwardness that good manners could paper over. It was, in the years when Philip was becoming a serious prospect for the heir to the British throne, a genuine and active liability, and the Queen Mother's world understood liabilities of that kind better than it understood almost anything else. Philip had 4 older sisters, and all 4 of them had married German princes in the years between the wars, and as the 1930s turned into the catastrophe of the following decade, those marriages placed Philip's closest blood relatives squarely on the wrong side of the conflict the country was about to fight. One of his brothers-in-law held rank in the German military. Several of the family moved in the orbit of the regime in the way that German aristocrats of that period and that class did. When his sister Cecily died in an air crash in 1937, along with her husband and 2 of her children, the 16-year-old Philip walked in the funeral procession through the streets of Darmstadt, and the photographs of that procession show the mourners flanked by the uniforms and the banners of the new German state, and the boy in the dark coat walking among them is the same boy who would, 10 years later, marry the future queen of the country those banners would soon be at war with. None of this was Philip's doing. He fought for Britain. He served with distinction in the Royal Navy through the entire war, against the regime his sister's world had embraced, and his own conduct was beyond reproach. But conduct was not the only thing the Queen Mother's establishment weighed when it assessed a man. It weighed connection, association, the look of a thing, the way a marriage would appear, and what it would imply, and on every one of those measures, Philip's family was a problem that no amount of his personal gallantry could fully solve. He had been, in the most literal sense, a young man without a country and without a family in any settled form. His parents had effectively ceased to function as parents before he was 10. His mother had vanished into a sanatorium and then re-emerged transformed into a religious recluse, devoted and remote. His father had drifted to the casinos of the south of France and a long, quiet decline, and would die there during the war, leaving his son almost nothing. And into the vacuum left by these absent parents had stepped the Mountbattens, his mother's English family, who had taken the homeless prince and given him an education and a direction and, above all, a patron in the form of his uncle. Philip had been raised, in effect, as a project of the Mountbatten interest, shaped and positioned and groomed for a future that his uncle had begun imagining for him long before Philip himself was old enough to imagine anything. He was sent to school in Germany for a time, to an institution run by the educator Kurt Hahn, and when the rise of the regime made Germany untenable for a school of Hahn's character, Philip followed Hahn to Scotland, to the new school the educator founded there, the austere and demanding Gordonston that would one day become the instrument of Philip's quarrel with the Queen Mother over the upbringing of Charles. He emerged from all of it tough, capable, self-contained, and entirely self-made, in the sense that he had built his own character out of the raw material of a childhood that had given him almost nothing stable to build on. And the self-made quality, which would have been admirable in almost any other context, was, in the context of the British monarchy, faintly suspect, because the monarchy did not especially value men who had made themselves. It valued men who had been born into the right place and shaped by the right institutions, and who carried the settled confidence of people who had never had to construct anything. Philip had constructed everything. He wore the construction lightly, but the Queen Mother's eye, which missed nothing, could see the seams. Because this is the thing about the Queen Mother's view of Philip that the standard romantic account leaves out. A great deal of her wariness toward the young man was, at the start, wariness toward the man standing behind him. Louis Mountbatten was, to the old guard of the British aristocracy and to Elizabeth in particular, a deeply suspect figure. He was clever, restless, openly ambitious for himself and for his line, and he had a way of arranging things to his own advantage that the people who watched him operate found difficult to forgive precisely because he was so good at it. The match between Philip and Princess Elizabeth was, by every credible account, something Mountbatten worked to bring about with great care, positioning his nephew, encouraging the connection, managing the introductions, treating the heir to the British throne as an opportunity to be secured for the Mountbatten interest. The Queen Mother saw exactly what he was doing. She had spent her life around men who arranged things, and she recognized arrangement when she saw it, and the recognition shaped her instinct toward the nephew the schemer was promoting. If Philip had arrived as simply a charming young naval officer with no patron and no agenda, she might have assessed him on his own terms. He did not arrive that way. He arrived as the chosen instrument of a man she did not trust, and the distrust attached itself to him, and it never entirely came off. The courtship had begun, in the way these things do, with a moment that was at the time invisible to almost everyone, and became significant only in hindsight. In the summer of 1939, the royal family visited the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, and a cadet named Philip was assigned to entertain the two young princesses, and the elder of them, Elizabeth, who was 13 years old, watched the 18-year-old prince leap over a tennis net and eat several plates of shrimp and generally behave with the loud physical confidence of a boy, entirely at ease in the world, and she was, by the accounts of the people around her, captivated in a way that did not fade. The romance, if it can be called that at such an age, developed slowly through the years of the war, through letters and through Philip's occasional visits to Windsor when his naval service permitted, and by the time it became something that the family had to take seriously, in the years immediately after the war ended, Elizabeth had made up her mind with a completeness that surprised the people who had assumed she would be guided by them. She wanted Philip. She had wanted him for years. She was not going to be talked out of it. And the firmness of her own daughter on the question was the first thing the Queen Mother had to work around, because it meant that the usual tool, the patient discouragement that would have allowed an unsuitable suitor to be edged out of the picture without anyone having to make a scene, was not available. Elizabeth was not going to be edged anywhere. The Queen Mother understood that, and she adjusted, and the adjustment was characteristic. If the marriage could not be prevented, then the marriage would have to be managed, and the man at the center of it would have to be brought into the institution on terms that contained the parts of him she found dangerous. The resistance to Philip in the years before the engagement was real, and it came from several directions, and the Queen Mother's hand in it was, in the way her hand was always present, difficult to see and impossible to miss. The king himself was reluctant, partly out of genuine caution, and partly out of the simple reluctance of a father to lose the daughter who was his great comfort. And a tour of South Africa was arranged in 1947 that functioned, among its other purposes, as a test of whether the attachment would survive a long separation. It survived. The courtiers were against the match almost to a man, and the courtiers were, it must be understood, the Queen Mother's people, the old guard of the palace whose entire view of the world she shared and embodied. Their objections were specific, and they were snobbish, and they were, by the standards of the time, not entirely unreasonable from the institution's point of view. Philip was foreign. He was Greek and Danish by title and German by a great deal of his actual upbringing and his family connection, and in 1947, 2 years after the end of a war against Germany, foreignness of that particular flavor was a genuine political liability. He was penniless, which mattered in a world where a suitable match was supposed to bring something to the table. His manners were considered rough, his directness considered alarming, his habit of saying exactly what he thought in rooms where nobody said exactly what they thought, considered a sign of someone who did not understand how things were done. And his sisters were married to Germans, some of whom had worn the uniform of the regime the country had just spent 6 years and a generation of its young men defeating. There is a word that attaches itself to the accounts of the Queen Mother's view of Philip in this period, and the word is one that she may or may not have actually used, and the uncertainty about whether she used it is less important than the fact that it captures something true about the atmosphere she presided over. The word is Hun. It was the dismissive term the wartime generation used for the Germans, and it carried all the contempt and suspicion that 6 years of war had built up. And in the circles around the Queen Mother, it was reportedly applied to Philip, the foreign prince with the German sisters and the German schooling and the German blood, as a way of marking him as not one of us, a man whose Englishness was a recent and incomplete acquisition rather than a birthright. Whether the Queen Mother herself ever spoke the word is contested by the people who have studied her most closely, and she was far too careful to have left a record of it if she did. But the contest over the single word misses the larger truth, which is that the attitude the word expressed was unmistakably the attitude of her world, and her world took its cues from her. The courtiers who looked down on Philip's foreignness were her courtiers. The atmosphere of suspicion that surrounded him in the years before the engagement was the atmosphere of her court. She did not need to use the word for the attitude to be hers, any more than she needed to write a memorandum for the Mountbatten name to be struck from the succession. The attitude flowed from her, through the people who served her, into the general assessment of Philip as an outsider who would have to prove himself, and the assessment shaped the long, cautious, reluctant process by which the marriage was eventually permitted. The objections that the courtiers raised against him were specific, and they were the objections of a closed world protecting its borders. He was too blunt. He said what he thought, and in a court where nobody said what they thought, where every sentence was managed and every opinion held in reserve, a man who spoke plainly was not refreshing but alarming, a loose element that could not be relied upon to behave. He was too poor, which mattered because the aristocratic world still operated, beneath its romantic surface, on the old logic of the suitable match, and a penniless prince brought nothing material to the arrangement except himself. He was too modern, too impatient with ceremony, too obviously inclined to ask why a thing was done a certain way, rather than simply accepting that it had always been done that way. And he was too closely tied to his uncle, whose ambitions the establishment watched with the wariness of people who had learned to recognize a man maneuvering for advantage. Every one of these objections was, from the establishment's point of view, a reason for caution, and the caution expressed itself as delay. The romance had to survive a long separation while Elizabeth toured South Africa with her parents in 1947, a separation that functioned, whatever else it was, as a test of whether the attachment would hold. It held. The engagement, when it was finally permitted to be announced, came only after years of the kind of patient discouragement that the establishment deployed against suitors it hoped would simply go away. And the discouragement failed only because Elizabeth refused to be discouraged, and her refusal was the one force in the entire situation that the Queen Mother could not manage around. That last point produced one of the small, telling cruelties of the wedding itself, a cruelty that Philip felt and never forgot, and that bore the fingerprints of the establishment the Queen Mother led. When he married Princess Elizabeth at Westminster Abbey in November of 1947, his 3 surviving sisters, the people who were left of his scattered family, were not invited. The reasoning was sound in the cold institutional sense that the Queen Mother always understood best. It was too soon after the war, the German connections were too raw, the optics of German princesses at the heart of a British royal wedding were a risk the palace was not willing to take. So the sisters stayed away, and Philip stood at the altar of the most important day of his life, as a man whose own family had been judged unsuitable to attend it, while his bride was surrounded by the vast and confident apparatus of the most secure royal family in the world. His mother was there, the deaf princess who had sheltered Jews in Athens during the occupation and would later be honored for it, dressed in the simple gray habit of the religious order she had founded, and her presence was permitted because she was beyond reproach. The sisters were not. Philip absorbed this in silence. He was good at absorbing things in silence, and he would get a great deal of practice over the following decades, much of it in response to decisions whose logic could be traced back, if you knew how to trace it, to the woman who never raised her voice. The marriage required Philip to give up almost everything that he had been. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles. He gave up the Greek Orthodox faith of his childhood and was received into the Church of England. He became a naturalized British subject and took a surname, and the surname he took was Mountbatten, the anglicized name of his mother's family, the name that had been engineered into respectability a generation earlier, and that carried with it the influence of the uncle the establishment did not trust. He had been a prince of 2 countries. He became, on paper, a commoner, and was then made a duke on the morning of his wedding, the Duke of Edinburgh, a British title to replace the foreign ones he had surrendered. The man who walked out of Westminster Abbey that November was, in a sense, a newly manufactured person, stripped of his origins and reassembled to the institution's specifications. And the reassembly had been necessary precisely because the institution, and the woman at its emotional center, had judged the original version unsuitable. He understood that the unsuitability had been the point. He had been required to become acceptable, and the requirement carried within it the permanent implication that he had started out unacceptable, and that implication is a difficult thing for a proud man to live alongside for the rest of his life. He lived alongside it for 54 years. The wedding itself, on the 20th of November in 1947, was a national event of the first order, and the public mood around it had nothing to do with the private reservations that had surrounded the match. The country was exhausted and gray, 2 years out of a war that had hollowed it out, still living under rationing, still counting its dead, and the marriage of the young heir to her handsome naval prince was exactly the kind of brightness the moment needed, a flash of color and romance and continuity against the drabness of the austerity years. The crowds were enormous. The streets were full. The bride wore a gown for which she had saved ration coupons like any other young woman of the period, and the groom, made Duke of Edinburgh that very morning, stood beside her at the altar of Westminster Abbey, as the cameras and the newsreels carried the spectacle to a country desperate for something to celebrate. And none of the public joy touched the quiet calculations that had gone on behind it. The years of discouragement, the testing, the snobbery, the excluded sisters, the wariness of the woman who smiled through the whole occasion as the perfect mother of the bride. The surface of the wedding was radiant. Underneath it ran everything that had been decided and judged and managed to get the foreign prince acceptable enough to stand where he was standing. The public saw the radiance. The public always saw the radiance. That was the entire point of the surface, and the Queen Mother was its supreme keeper. And on the day her elder daughter married the man she had never wanted for her, she gave the country a portrait of maternal happiness, so convincing that nobody watching would have suspected there was anything to keep beneath it at all. It was, in its way, a preview of the next 54 years. The warm and flawless surface presented to the world, the cooler and more complicated truth held carefully out of sight, the smile doing the work it was built to do. The first few years of the marriage were, by a margin that would never be repeated, the happiest and the most ordinary of his royal life, and the ordinariness of them was made possible by a fact that everyone assumed was permanent and that turned out to be temporary. Elizabeth was not yet queen. Her father was alive, the king was the king, and the young couple occupied the position of an heir and her husband, which carried obligations but not the full and consuming weight of the throne. Philip continued his naval career, which he loved and at which he was genuinely good, and for a period in the late 1940s and early 1950s he was posted to Malta, and Elizabeth came out to join him, and they lived something that approached the life of an ordinary naval officer and his wife. She drove herself. She went to the hairdresser like other women. He commanded his own ship. They were, for a brief window, a couple rather than an institution, and the people who knew them in this period describe Elizabeth as never happier than she was in Malta, free of the palace and the protocol and the great gravitational pull of her destiny, living a version of life that her position would otherwise never have allowed. That window was the thing Philip would spend the rest of his life, on some level, mourning, because everything that came after it took the version of his wife he had married in Malta and slowly absorbed her into the machine, and Philip held, fairly or not, a particular set of people responsible for the machine, and at the head of that set of people, embodying its values and protecting its habits, stood his mother-in-law. The children came in those early years, before the throne arrived to consume everything. Charles was born in 1948, at Buckingham Palace, while Philip played squash to burn off the tension of the wait. And Anne followed in 1950, and for a brief period the young family had the shape of an ordinary family, a father with a career he loved, a mother not yet weighed down by a crown, 2 small children, a home of their own. Philip threw himself into fatherhood in the way that the men of his time and his formation understood fatherhood, which is to say, he was present in bursts and absent in stretches, away with the Navy for long periods, and then home to a household that he wanted to run on his own terms. And it was in these years, in the running of the household and the raising of the children, that the first faint outlines of the long contest with the Queen Mother began to appear, though they were faint enough that nobody would have called them a contest yet. Philip had ideas about how his children should be raised, firm ideas, the ideas of a man whose own hard childhood had given him strong convictions about discipline and resilience and the dangers of softness. The Queen Mother had ideas too, the opposite ideas, the ideas of a woman who believed in warmth and gentleness and the cultivation of charm. The children were small enough, in these years, that the difference did not yet matter. It would matter enormously later, when the question of Charles's schooling forced the 2 philosophies into open collision. But in the early 1950s, it was only a difference of temperament between a son-in-law and a mother-in-law who did not much understand each other, the kind of difference that exists in countless families and produces nothing worse than the occasional strained silence at the dinner table. What gave the difference its charge? What turned an ordinary in-law friction into something with the potential to become a 50-year war? Was the thing that was about to happen, and that nobody in that household could prevent. Elizabeth was going to become queen, and when she did, the ordinary difference of temperament between her husband and her mother would be transformed into a struggle for influence over the most powerful woman in the country, and everything that had been small and manageable in the Malta years would become large and structural and permanent. Philip, in the Malta years, was a husband and a father and a naval officer, and his mother-in-law was a recently widowed dowager, finding her way to a new role, and the two of them rubbed against each other in the ordinary way of people who are very different and have been thrown together by a marriage. None of it was a crisis. None of it had to become a crisis. The crisis was made by a death that nobody had planned for, on a February morning at Sandringham, and the death turned two people who simply did not understand each other into two people who were now competing, for the rest of their lives, over the guidance of a queen. The hinge of the entire story, the moment that turned a manageable tension into a decades-long structural conflict, came on the 6th of February in 1952. King George VI, the stammering second son whom the Queen Mother had helped survive the throne, whose health had been worn down by the strains of the war and the years that followed, died in his sleep at Sandringham at the age of 56. He was found in the morning. The news had to travel halfway around the world to reach his daughter, who was in Kenya at the time, at the start of a Commonwealth tour, staying at a lodge built into a fig tree. Elizabeth had gone up the tree a princess and come down a queen, and the rest of her life, and the rest of the lives of the two people who loved her most, was determined in that single overnight transition. Because the death of the king did three things at once, and all three of them set the Queen Mother and Prince Philip on a collision course that the previous 5 years had only hinted at. The first thing it did was leave the Queen Mother shattered in a way that was entirely genuine and that should not be minimized in the rush to examine the politics that followed. She had loved her husband. The marriage had been real. The partnership had been real. And his death at 56, a death she attributed in significant part to the burden that the abdication had dumped on him, left her at 51 with the central relationship of her life suddenly gone and her purpose suddenly unclear. She was no longer the queen. She was the queen's mother, the dowager, a figure whose role in the institution had to be reinvented because it no longer came with the position that had defined it. For a period after the king's death she withdrew, genuinely grief-stricken, and there was real uncertainty about what she would become. The second thing the king's death did was hand Philip a defeat so immediate and so personal that it set the tone for everything that followed, and the defeat had to do with where the family would live, which sounds trivial and was anything but. Before the accession, Philip and Elizabeth had lived at Clarence House, which Philip had taken a close personal interest in renovating and modernizing, treating it as the one domestic space that was genuinely his, the place where he was the master of the household, in the ordinary way that a husband is master of his household. After the accession, the new queen had to move to Buckingham Palace, the working center of the monarchy, and Philip did not want to go. He argued, reasonably enough, that the family could continue to live at Clarence House and that he could commute to the palace for the business of state, that there was no need to uproot a young family and install them in the cold and enormous machinery of Buckingham Palace simply because tradition demanded it. He lost the argument. The old guard insisted that the sovereign must live at the palace, that the symbolism required it, that the thing had always been done a certain way and would continue to be done a certain way, and the new queen, young and uncertain and surrounded by people who had been managing the monarchy since before she was born, deferred to the tradition rather than to her husband. And here is the detail that turned a logistical dispute into a small permanent wound. When the family moved out of Clarence House and into Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, the home Philip had built for himself, was given to the Queen Mother. She moved in. The house he had renovated with his own hands and his own ideas became the residence of the woman whose world had just defeated him on the question of whether he could keep it. He had been pushed out of his own home and into the great machine, and his mother-in-law had taken the home he was pushed out of. He noticed. He was a man who noticed everything, and he had a long memory, and the symbolism of it was not lost on him for a moment. The third thing the king's death did was the most important, because it was the thing that turned a personal rivalry into a war over the future of the monarchy itself. It created a young, uncertain, 25-year-old queen who needed guidance, and it placed two people in a position to give it. And those two people held diametrically opposed views about almost everything, and they were now in direct and permanent competition for influence over the single most powerful person in the country. The Queen Mother had been inside the institution for 30 years. She understood it, she embodied it, and she had a daughter who trusted her judgment, with the trust of a child for a parent who has never let them down. Philip was the husband, the man Elizabeth loved, the father of her children, and he had his own claim on her instincts and his own urgent set of ideas about what the monarchy needed to become. Both of them wanted to shape her. Both of them believed, with complete sincerity, that they knew what was best for her and for the crown. And what was best, in the Queen Mother's view, was continuity, tradition, the old ways, the careful preservation of the surface. What was best, in Philip's view, was reform, modernization, efficiency, the dragging of the institution into the 20th century. They could not both win. The contest between them, conducted entirely through their separate relationships with the same young woman, would run for the next 50 years, and its first great battle began within weeks of the king's death, and it was a battle that Philip lost so completely and so publicly that the manner of his losing tells you almost everything about how the Queen Mother fought. The Queen Mother's grief, in those first months, was real, and it was also, in the way that everything about her managed to be two things at once, the foundation of her new authority. She had lost her husband, and she reinvented herself, over the following year, as the keeper of his memory and the guardian of the world he had represented, and the reinvention gave her a moral position over her daughter that no one else in the family could touch. She was the widow of the beloved king. She was the living link to the father the young queen had adored and lost. When she spoke to Elizabeth about how things should be done, she spoke with the authority of the man who was gone, the implication always present that this was how your father would have wanted it, that the traditions she was defending were the traditions he had upheld, that to side with her was to honor his memory, and to side against her was, in some unspoken way, to betray it. It was an extraordinarily powerful position, and she had built it out of genuine grief, and the genuineness of the grief did not make the power any less real or any less useful. Against this, Philip had almost nothing to set. He was the husband, and the husband's claim is strong, but the husband could not invoke the dead king, could not wrap his preferences in the authority of the father the queen had lost, could not make every disagreement a question of loyalty to a beloved memory. The Queen Mother could and did, and the doing of it was so seamlessly woven into her grief and her warmth that it never looked like strategy at all. It looked like a mother and a daughter, mourning together, holding to the things the father had loved. That it was also a positioning, a securing of influence over the new sovereign at the precise moment when influence over her mattered most, was the kind of truth that lived permanently beneath the surface of everything the Queen Mother did, visible to Philip, who understood exactly what was happening, and invisible to almost everyone else. The battle was about a name. It sounds small. It was not small. When Elizabeth became queen, a question arose that the constitutional machinery of the monarchy had not had to confront in living memory, which was the question of what the royal house would now be called. The established practice in dynastic affairs was straightforward enough. When a woman inherits a throne and has children, those children take the surname of their father, and the royal house is named accordingly. Elizabeth's father had been a Windsor, and the house had been the House of Windsor since 1917, when George V had changed the family's German name in the middle of the First World War. But Elizabeth had married, and her husband's name, the name he had taken on becoming British, was Mountbatten. By the ordinary logic of these things, her children would be Mountbattens, and the House of Windsor would give way to the House of Mountbatten. The throne, after a single generation, would pass to a new dynastic name, and that name would be the name of the family that had spent a generation engineering its way upward from the discarded German Battenberg. Louis Mountbatten understood this perfectly, and being Louis Mountbatten, he could not keep his understanding to himself. At a dinner at his estate, in the weeks after the accession, he was reported to have remarked, with the satisfaction of a man watching a long campaign come to fruition, that the House of Mountbatten now reigned in England. Whether the words were precisely those, or whether the form of them was sharpened in the retelling, the substance was real and it was characteristic, and the remark did what indiscreet remarks always do, which is travel to exactly the people it should not have reached. It reached the old Queen Mary, the widow of George V, the formidable dowager who had been a queen consort when the Queen Mother was a girl and who regarded the dynasty as the great project of her life. Queen Mary was horrified. The thought of her late husband's house, the House of Windsor that he had created to make the monarchy safe in a hostile century, being swept aside in favor of the Mountbatten name within months of her granddaughter-in-law's accession, was to her a kind of dynastic catastrophe. And the remark reached, through the same channels, the Queen Mother, who shared Queen Mary's horror completely, and who had her own additional reasons to want the Mountbatten ambition checked, reasons that ran back through her distrust of Louis Mountbatten, to her wariness of the nephew he had installed in her family. The two of them, the old dowager and the new one, were aligned, and they were joined by a third and decisive figure, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who had his own reasons of state to prefer the continuity of the Windsor name, and who carried the constitutional authority to do something about it. The opposition assembled itself with the speed and the quiet coordination of an establishment recognizing a threat to itself, and the machinery moved. In April of 1952, within 2 months of her accession, the young queen issued a proclamation declaring that her house and her descendants would continue to be known as the House and Family of Windsor. The Mountbatten name would not pass to the throne. Philip's name, the name he had given up his own princely titles to take, the one thing of his own that he might have contributed to the line of succession, would not name his children or his dynasty. The thing was decided, and it was decided against him, and it was decided fast. Philip's reaction to the proclamation was one of the few moments in his long royal life when the controlled surface cracked far enough for the feeling underneath to become visible, and the feeling underneath was rage and humiliation in roughly equal measure. The line he was reported to have used has survived because it captured the wound so exactly. He said that he was the only man in the country not permitted to give his own name to his own children. And in a darker and more bitter register he was reported to have described himself as nothing but a bloody amoeba, a creature with no function except to provide what the institution required of him and to be denied everything else. The bitterness was not irrational. Consider what the proclamation said to him about his place. He had given up his nationality, his titles, his religion, and his naval independence to marry into this family. He had been required to make himself acceptable by becoming someone new. And now, when the moment came to contribute the one thing that a husband and father ordinarily contributes, his name, the institution had reached down and taken even that, and had given him in exchange a position that he experienced as ceremonial castration, a man who walked 2 steps behind his wife, who had no constitutional role, who was not permitted to pass on his name, and who was expected to be grateful for the privilege. The amoeba line was the line of a man who had understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how little of himself he had been allowed to keep. And the question that matters for this story is what role the Queen Mother played in producing that outcome, and the answer is the answer that always applies to her, which is that her role was real, and her role was almost entirely invisible. There is no document in which she instructs the Prime Minister to overturn the Mountbatten name. There is no recorded conversation in which she directs the proclamation. There never was, with her, a paper trail for the things that needed to remain deniable, and the absence of the paper trail was not a sign that she was uninvolved. It was the proof of her method. What there is, instead, is the consistent pattern. She wanted the Windsor name preserved, both because she shared Queen Mary's dynastic conviction and because preserving it dealt a defeat to the Mountbatten interest she distrusted. She communicated that preference through the channels she used for everything that mattered, the cultivation of the people whose decisions would determine the outcome, above all her own daughter, in whose ear the warm and reasonable voice of a trusted mother carried more weight than any other voice in the country. Churchill provided the constitutional muscle and the public face of the decision, which was useful precisely because it allowed the Queen Mother's hand to remain hidden behind the Prime Minister's. Mountbatten, watching his great dynastic prize taken away, blamed Churchill, and he was right that Churchill had opposed him, and he underestimated how much of the outcome had been shaped before Churchill ever became formally involved, in the quiet cultivation of the young Queen's instinct that the Queen Mother had been conducting since the accession. The man whose ambition had been defeated never fully understood who had defeated him. He thought he had lost to the Prime Minister. He had lost in significant part to a woman who had never said a single word he could point to. The name war did not in fact end in 1952, and the second act of it is worth following, because it shows both the persistence of Philip's grievance and the limits of even the Queen Mother's ability to hold a line forever. The defeat rankled in Philip for years, and it rankled in his uncle for longer, and the two of them did not simply accept the proclamation as final. They kept the question alive, kept pressing, kept looking for an opening, and the opening came toward the end of the decade, in the period before the Queen gave birth to her third child. By then the situation had changed. Churchill was gone from office. The old guard had thinned. The Queen herself, no longer the uncertain 25-year-old of 1952, but a confident monarch in the middle of her reign, was more willing to weigh her husband's wishes against her mother's, and Philip's wish on the name question was something he had never stopped pressing. The result, in 1960, was a compromise, and the compromise was a partial and quiet reversal of the total defeat of 8 years earlier. A new declaration established that while the royal house would remain the House of Windsor, the personal surname of the Queen's descendants, for those of them who needed a surname and were not styled as Royal Highnesses, would be Mountbatten Windsor. Philip's name was admitted to the line at last, joined to the Windsor name in a hyphenated arrangement that gave him, finally, something of what he had lost. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. It was a small victory, and a late one, and an incomplete one, but it mattered to Philip out of all proportion to its practical significance, because it touched the wound that the original defeat had opened. He had spent 8 years as the man not permitted to give his name to his children. The compromise of 1960 meant that his name would, after all, survive in the family he had married into, would attach itself to the descendants of the line, would not be entirely erased. And the timing of it, just before the birth of Prince Andrew, the first child born to the Queen after the question was settled, gave it a particular resonance, as though the institution had finally, grudgingly, made room for the man it had spent so long keeping in his place. The Queen Mother did not, by any account, fight the 1960 compromise with the intensity she had brought to the 1952 defeat. The principle she cared about most, that the house remain Windsor, was preserved, and the concession to Philip on the surname was one she could live with, and she was, whatever else she was, a realist who knew when a line could no longer be held and when a small surrender served the larger interest. But the 8-year gap between the total defeat and the partial reversal is itself a measure of how completely she had won the first round, and of how much patience and persistence Philip had needed to claw back even the fraction he eventually recovered. She had taken everything in 1952. He had spent the rest of the decade getting back a sliver. The arithmetic of the exchange tells you who held the real power in the early years of the reign, and it had not been the man married to the Queen. The name war, in both its acts, established the essential shape of how the two of them would deal with each other for the next half-century, and the shape had a particular and frustrating geometry from Philip's side of it. He pushed in the open and lost in the dark. His wishes were always visible, always stated, always pressed with the directness that was his nature, and the forces that defeated them were always invisible, always unstated, always operating through atmospheres and influences and the quiet shaping of the Queen's instincts that he could feel pressing against him and could never bring into the light. He was a man fighting in daylight against an opponent who fought only at night, and the asymmetry was maddening, and it was the source of so much of the famous Philip temper that the public would later puzzle over. The man was not difficult by nature so much as he had been made difficult by decades of this particular kind of losing, the kind where you can never see the hand that beats you and can never make anyone admit that a fight is even taking place. He knew the hand was hers. He had known it since 1952, and he could never, in 50 years, get her to put it on the table. For Philip, the name War established a template that would repeat itself, with variations, for the rest of his life. He would have an idea, or an instinct, or a thing he wanted, and he would push for it directly, in his blunt and forceful way, in the open, where his pushing could be observed and resisted. And the resistance, when it came, would come not from a person he could argue with, but from an atmosphere, a slow and general and unaccountable pressure that flowed through the institution and that consistently produced the outcome he did not want. And behind that atmosphere, never visible but always present, would be the influence of his mother-in-law, working through her daughter and through the old guard who were her people, shaping the result without ever appearing in it. He could feel her behind the wall. He could never get to her. She gave him nothing to fight. That was the most maddening thing about her, from his point of view, and it was the source of her power. A man who is visibly strategic produces resistance, because people can see the strategy and organize against it. A woman whose strategy is invisible, because it is indistinguishable from her warmth and her charm, and her apparently artless maternal concern, produces no resistance, because there is nothing visible to resist. Philip was the most visibly strategic person in the family. The Queen Mother was the most invisibly strategic. He spent his career being beaten by an opponent he could never bring into the open, and the experience of it shaped him into the famously prickly and impatient and difficult man that the public came to know, a man whose temper was at least partly the accumulated residue of decades of losing to someone who never even acknowledged that a contest was taking place. The second front of the Long War was the palace itself, the apparatus of courtiers and private secretaries and household officials who actually ran the day-to-day operation of the monarchy, and this front matters because it is where the Queen Mother's influence and Philip's frustration met most directly, even though the two of them almost never confronted each other across it. Philip arrived in the institution with the instincts of a naval officer and a reformer. He had run a ship. He understood efficiency, chain of command, the elimination of waste, the value of doing things in the most sensible way, rather than the most traditional way. And what he found, when he looked at the running of the royal household, was an apparatus that struck him as absurdly antiquated, riddled with pointless tradition, staffed by men who had been doing things the same way for so long that they had lost the ability to imagine doing them any other way, and resistant to any change, with the deep and patient resistance of an organism protecting itself. He wanted to modernize it. He wanted to bring it into the century. He had ideas about communications, about openness, about the elimination of the small, ridiculous customs that served no purpose except their own continuation, and he pushed his ideas with characteristic force, and he ran straight into the old guard. The old guard had a leader, in the early years, and his name was Sir Alan Lascelles, known as Tommy, the private secretary to the sovereign, a man of immense experience and immense conservatism who had served the monarchy since the reign of George V, and who regarded the institution as a sacred trust to be preserved exactly as he had received it. Lascelles and Philip detested each other with the clean mutual contempt of two men who represent everything the other finds intolerable. To Lascelles, Philip was a brash, foreign, ill-mannered upstart who did not understand the institution he had married into and who needed to be kept in his place for the good of the crown. To Philip, Lascelles was the perfect specimen of the suffocating old establishment, a man in gray whose entire function was to ensure that nothing ever changed, and that the husband of the Queen was reminded, at every turn, of how little he was permitted to do. The conflict between them was real, and it was bitter, and it ran through the early years of the reign as a constant low friction. The specific reforms Philip pushed for were not, in retrospect, the demands of a wild radical. They were the ordinary common sense of a man who had run things in the real world. He wanted the household accounts examined and the waste cut. He wanted the great archaic structure of overlapping departments and inherited sinecures rationalized. He wanted the monarchy to communicate with the public it depended on, to let the cameras in, to allow the country to see something of the family that the country was being asked to support, on the entirely sound reasoning that an institution which hides itself completely will eventually be wondered about and then resented. He took an interest in the running of the estates and modernized the farming at Sandringham and the management of Balmoral, dragging operations that had been run for generations on the assumption that money grew on the grouse moors into something resembling efficiency. Each of these was sensible. Each of these was also a disturbance of a settled order, and the settled order had its defenders, and the defenders regarded Philip's sense as an assault. The old guard did not argue with him on the merits, because arguing on the merits would have meant conceding that there were merits. They simply slowed everything down, referred everything to committee, raised the obstacle of precedent, and waited, with the patience of an organism that knows it will outlast any single irritation, for the energy of the reformer to exhaust itself against the soft and endless resistance of the way things had always been done. And the point, for this story, is that the old guard was the Queen Mother's world. These were her people. Lascelles and the courtiers like him shared her values completely. They believed what she believed about the monarchy, that it survived through continuity and tradition and the careful preservation of the surface, and they resisted what she resisted, which was the modernizing, reforming, efficiency-minded impulse that Philip represented. She did not need to instruct them to obstruct Philip. They obstructed him as a matter of shared instinct, because his project threatened the thing they all loved, and her presence behind them, the great patron and embodiment of the traditional way, gave their obstruction a weight and a legitimacy it would not otherwise have had. When Philip pushed against the old guard, he was pushing, in effect, against the Queen Mother, even though she was nowhere in the room and would have been genuinely surprised to be accused of involvement. The institution defended itself, and she was the institution's heart, and the defense flowed naturally from everything she was. Philip won some of these battles eventually. He did, over the years, force through a great many of his reforms, because he was relentless and he was right about a fair amount of it, and because his wife did, in the end, trust him on the practical running of things in a way she did not always trust her mother. But the early years were a long, grinding war of attrition against an establishment that the Queen Mother stood behind, and the experience of fighting it taught Philip a permanent lesson about where the real resistance to him lived and who, in the final analysis, it served. If you are finding this story as fascinating as I am, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me keep bringing you stories like this one. There was a financial dimension to the difference between them that was almost a comedy of incompatibility, and it is worth examining because it captures the temperamental gulf so precisely. Philip the Reformer was, by the standards of his world, careful with money. He thought about cost, he resented waste. He believed that the monarchy had an obligation to be seen to be reasonable in its spending, particularly in the austerity years after the war, when the country was managing rationing, and the difference between the royal family's lifestyle and the population's was a sensitive matter. He took over the running of the great royal estates, Sandringham and Balmoral, and he set about modernizing them and making them more efficient and bringing some commercial sense to operations that had been run for generations, on the assumption that money was somebody else's problem, and the Queen Mother was, on the question of money, the precise opposite of her son-in-law in every particular. She spent without reference to what she had. She maintained an enormous household, kept racehorses, collected art, entertained on a scale that her income could not support, and accumulated, over the decades, an overdraft at the royal family's bank that ran into the millions and that was quietly absorbed by the institution's financial machinery in ways that never became the public scandal it would have been for anyone else. To Philip, this was exactly the kind of unaccountable extravagance that the monarchy could not afford, the spending of a woman who had confused her own pleasure with the requirements of the crown, and who was protected from the consequences of her habits by an institution too sentimental and too deferential to ever tell her no. To the Queen Mother, Philip's concern with money was vulgar, the instinct of a man who did not understand that a monarchy was supposed to be magnificent and that magnificence had a cost, the penny-pinching of someone who had been poor and who carried the anxieties of the poor into a position where they did not belong. Neither of them was going to change. The careful reformer and the magnificent spender shared a family for 50 years, and each of them regarded the other's relationship to money as a small ongoing proof of the other's fundamental unsuitability for the institution they both served. But the deepest battle between them, the one that cut closest to the bone because it involved a child they both loved, was the battle over how to raise the heir. And this is where the cost of their long Cold War stops being abstract and becomes a small boy caught between a hard father and a soft grandmother, paying the price for a disagreement he was too young to understand. The boy was Charles, born in 1948, the heir to the throne, and from his earliest years he was a sensitive, anxious, easily wounded child. A child who needed warmth and reassurance and gentle handling, and he had the misfortune to be born to a father who believed that exactly the opposite was what a boy required. Philip's own childhood had been hard. He had been shaped by upheaval and abandonment and the discipline of austere schools, and he had survived it, and he had emerged tough and capable and self-reliant, and he believed, with the complete sincerity of a man generalizing from his own experience, that hardship was what made a boy into a man, and that softness was a danger to be drilled out rather than a need to be met. He looked at his sensitive son and he saw a boy who needed toughening, and he set about toughening him with the best of intentions and the worst of results. He could be impatient with Charles, dismissive of his sensitivities, sharp in the way that men of his generation and his formation were often sharp with sons they found insufficiently tough. The relationship between them was difficult from the start, and it caused Charles a kind of pain that he carried into his adult life and that the public would eventually come to understand. And standing on the other side of Charles, offering him exactly the warmth that his father withheld, was the Queen Mother. She adored her grandson, and her adoration was the uncomplicated, unconditional, enveloping warmth that she was so good at producing, the warmth that made a person feel completely seen and completely safe. And to Charles, who got so little of that from his father, his grandmother became a refuge, the one adult in his world who seemed to value him for exactly what he was, rather than for what he was failing to become. He was happy at Royal Lodge with her in a way he was rarely happy anywhere else. She represented, for him, the soft and gentle and aristocratic world of tradition and beauty and kindness, the world she embodied so perfectly, and he loved her for it with a depth that lasted her entire life and his. The bond between the Queen Mother and Charles was one of the great relationships of both their lives, and it was, among everything else it was, a quiet rebuke to Philip, because it represented everything Philip was not giving his son, offered freely by the woman Philip already had reason to resent. The disagreement came to a head over the most consequential decision in a young aristocrat's life, which was the question of his schooling. Philip had a clear and firm view. Charles should go to Cheam, the preparatory school Philip himself had attended, and then to Gordonston, the Scottish boarding school in the remote north that Philip had also attended and that he credited with making him the man he was. Gordonston was a hard place, deliberately so. It was founded on the principle that boys are improved by physical hardship, cold, discipline, the challenge of the outdoors, the stripping away of comfort and privilege. Philip had thrived there. He believed Charles would thrive there too, or that even if Charles did not thrive there, the hardship would be good for him, would toughen the soft places, would make him into something more like the hardy prince Philip thought the throne required. And the Queen Mother thought this was a terrible idea, and she said so, and the way she said so was characteristic of the whole long war between them. She did not confront Philip. She did not have a shouting match with her son-in-law about the upbringing of the heir. What she did was make the case for the alternative, quietly and persuasively, to the person who could actually decide, which was the Queen. The Queen Mother believed Charles should go to Eton, the great school just across the river from Windsor Castle, close to home, gentler than Gordonston, more suited to a sensitive and aristocratic boy, the natural school for the heir to the throne, and one where he could be near the grandmother who understood him. She wrote to her daughter making the case for Eton. She argued that the proximity to Windsor mattered, that Charles's temperament suited Eton far better than it suited the harsh isolation of Gordonston. that the boy should be educated in a way that fit who he actually was, rather than forced through an ordeal designed for a different kind of child. It was a real intervention, made through her real channel, the warm maternal voice in the Queen's ear, and it was, in this instance, an intervention on behalf of the grandson she loved against the father whose plan she thought was cruel. She lost. This time, the directness of Philip prevailed over the indirection of the Queen Mother, because the schooling of a son is one of the few areas where a father's authority was hard for even the Queen Mother to overcome, and because the Queen, caught between her mother and her husband, deferred to her husband on the upbringing of the boy who would be king. Charles was sent to Gordonston, and Gordonston was, for Charles, exactly the misery the Queen Mother had feared it would be. He was bullied. He was cold and homesick and unhappy. The hard regime that had suited his iron-built father was a torment to his sensitive nature, and he endured years of it, and he hated it, and the experience marked him. The Queen Mother had been right about her grandson, and she had lost the argument anyway, and the boy she loved had been sent away to suffer in a place she had warned against, on the insistence of the son-in-law she had never warmed to. It is difficult to imagine that the outcome softened her view of Philip. It is easy to imagine that it hardened it, that every letter from an unhappy Charles at Gordonston was a confirmation of a judgment she had made about the boy's father long ago, a judgment that this was a man who did not understand the things she understood, who mistook harshness for strength and tradition's gentler virtues for weakness, and who was wrong, in the way she found most unforgivable, about a child. There was a daughter in this story, too, and the way Philip related to her throws the quarrel over Charles into sharper relief. Anne, the second child, was everything Charles was not. She was sturdy, physically fearless, direct, unsentimental, a girl who rode hard and spoke plainly, and met the world with exactly the kind of unflinching confidence that Philip prized and understood. He adored her. The relationship between Philip and Anne was the easy, uncomplicated bond of two people of the same temperament, and it stood in painful contrast to the difficult, strained, mutually baffled relationship between Philip and his sensitive elder son. Philip was not a man incapable of loving a child or of being close to a child. He was a man who could only be close to a child who was like him, and Anne was like him, and Charles was not, and the difference was not Charles's fault, and not Philip's fault either, but the consequence of a mismatch of natures that no amount of effort on either side could resolve. And the Queen Mother, watching this, drew the conclusion she was always going to draw, which was that the problem lay with Philip rather than with the mismatch, that a better father would have found a way to reach the son who needed reaching, rather than lavishing his ease on the daughter who needed nothing, and that Philip's difficulty with Charles was of a piece with everything else she had concluded about him over the years, a failure of warmth, a failure of the gentler intelligence that she possessed in abundance, and that he, in her assessment, lacked. She filled the gap herself. That is the heart of what the Charles relationship meant in the long war between his grandmother and his father. Where Philip was hard, the Queen Mother was soft. Where Philip was impatient, she was endlessly indulgent. Where Philip demanded that the boy become something tougher than he was, she accepted the boy exactly as he was and told him, in 1,000 small ways across his entire childhood, that exactly as he was enough. To a sensitive boy starved of approval at home, this was the difference between drowning and air, and Charles attached himself to his grandmother with the gratitude of a child who has found the one adult who does not want to change him. He spent as much time at her side as he could. He absorbed her tastes, her love of beauty and tradition, and the gentle aristocratic pleasures, her way of moving through the world with grace rather than force. He became, in many respects, her creation, formed in her image, sharing her temperament, carrying her values forward into the next generation, and the more he became hers, the less he became his father's, and Philip could see it happening and could do nothing to stop it. The boy was being claimed, gently and lovingly and irreversibly, by the woman across the family divide, and every year that passed bound Charles closer to his grandmother and left him further from his father, and there was a quiet satisfaction in this for the Queen Mother that she would never have acknowledged, and that was, nonetheless, real. She had lost the argument over Eton. She had won the boy, and winning the boy was worth a great deal more, in the long run, than winning the argument would have been. It is worth pausing on what this cost Charles, because he was, in the end, the child caught between two adults at war, and children caught between adults at war pay for the privilege whether they understand it or not. He grew up loving a grandmother who represented one half of a divided family and fearing a father who represented the other, and the division ran straight through him, and he carried it into his adult life as a man permanently uncertain of himself, permanently in search of the approval his father had withheld, permanently drawn to the warm and traditional and aristocratic world his grandmother had taught him to love. The shape of Charles's entire adult character, the sensitivity, the woundedness, the search for validation, the deep attachment to the old gentle ways, can be read as the product of having been raised in the crossfire between his father's hardness and his grandmother's softness, of having had no settled ground to stand on because the ground itself was contested. The two people who shaped him most were pulling in opposite directions, and the boy was the rope, and the strain left marks that never entirely faded. The Queen Mother loved him completely and genuinely, and her love was the great comfort of his childhood, and it was also, viewed from a slightly colder distance, a move in a long game, the claiming of the heir for her side of a war that the heir was too young to know was being fought. Both things were true at once. With the Queen Mother, both things were always true at once. That was the whole difficulty of her. Here, though, is where the honest account has to slow down and complicate the simple story. Because the simple story, the despise of the title, is too small for what was actually happening between these two people, and the truth is more interesting than the simple version, the way the truth usually is. The Queen Mother and Prince Philip were not two cartoon antagonists locked in mutual loathing. They were two people of genuine conviction who happened to hold opposite convictions about the institution they both loved and the woman they both wanted to protect. And the conflict between them was, at its root, a conflict of values rather than a conflict of personalities, even though it expressed itself, over the decades, in the accumulated friction of two personalities that grated against each other at every point of contact. The Queen Mother believed, with her whole self, that the monarchy was a thing of surface and continuity and managed warmth, that its power lay in what it appeared to be, and that its survival depended on the careful preservation of appearances and the avoidance of anything that disturbed them. Philip believed, with his whole self, that the monarchy was a thing that had to actually work, that survived by being reformed and modernized and made fit for purpose, that would die if it became merely a beautiful surface with nothing functioning underneath. These were not petty positions. They were serious and defensible philosophies of how an ancient institution survives in a changing world. And the remarkable thing about the long reign that followed is that the monarchy ended up needing both of them, the Queen Mother's preservation of the magic and Philip's modernization of the machine, and got both of them, precisely because the two people who held these opposed views were both placed at the center of the same family and spent 50 years pulling in their opposite directions and producing, between them, a balance that the Queen Mother's wariness of Philip was, in this light, not malice. It was the entirely sincere reaction of a woman who looked at her son-in-law and saw a genuine threat to the things she believed the monarchy needed. A man whose reforming energy and blunt directness and impatience with tradition struck her as a danger to the careful surface she had spent her life maintaining. She was not wrong that he was a threat to that surface. He was. He spent his career disturbing surfaces. From her point of view, the man her daughter had married was a force of disruption inside an institution that survived on the avoidance of disruption, and her management of him, the containment, the quiet checking of his ambitions, the cultivation of her daughter's instinct toward the traditional course, was not the cruelty of a woman who enjoyed his suffering, but the considered work of a woman protecting the thing she loved from what she sincerely believed was a danger to it. She was wrong about some of it. She was wrong about Gordonston, and she was right, and she lost anyway. She was probably wrong, in the long run, about how much modernization the monarchy needed, because the institution did need a great deal of what Philip dragged it toward, and a monarchy that had remained frozen in the Queen Mother's preferred amber would very likely not have survived the century as well as it did. But wrong or right, Her opposition to him came from conviction, and conviction is a harder and more durable thing than malice, because malice can be confronted and conviction cannot. And Philip's view of her was the mirror image of the same thing, conviction rather than malice. He did not hate his mother-in-law in any simple way either. He could be, when the occasion required it, perfectly correct toward her, and there were moments of genuine warmth between them across the decades, family moments, shared griefs, the long familiarity of people who have been in each other's lives for half a century. But underneath the correctness ran a steady, settled exasperation. The exasperation of a practical man toward a woman he regarded as sentimental, extravagant, evasive, surrounded by flatterers, addicted to the avoidance of difficult decisions, and protected by an institution too soft to ever require anything of her. He found her infuriating in the specific way that a person who confronts problems finds a person who manages around them infuriating. She would never say no to him directly. She would never have the argument. She would smile and agree in the room, and then the thing he wanted would somehow fail to happen, blocked by an atmosphere he could feel and could not trace. And he always knew, that the atmosphere came from her, and he could never prove it, and the impossibility of proving it was a low and constant aggravation that ran beneath 50 years of family Christmases and official lunches and photographed gatherings at which the two of them stood near each other and smiled. That was the texture of it. Not the operatic hatred the title suggests, but something quieter and more corrosive and far more durable, two people who shared a family and a love and an institution and almost nothing else, who disagreed at the deepest level about what the monarchy was and how the woman they both loved should be guided, and who conducted their disagreement over 50 years entirely beneath the surface, through their separate relationships with the Queen, through the cultivation of allies and the management of atmospheres and the patient pursuit of opposite goals, while maintaining the whole time the perfect public courtesy that the institution demanded of them both. They never had it out. There was never a scene. There was never a moment of open rupture that a newspaper could report or a biographer could point to as the turning point, because both of them understood, with the deep professional understanding of people who had given their lives to the monarchy, that the surface had to be maintained, that the family could not be seen to be at war with itself, that whatever they felt about each other was less important than the appearance of unity that the institution required. So they maintained it. The Queen Mother maintained it, because maintaining surfaces was the entire art of her life. Philip maintained it because he understood duty even when he resented the specific thing duty required, and because the woman he loved would have been hurt by an open breach with her mother. And Philip, for all his prickliness, was not a man who would deliberately hurt his wife. And there is the heart of why neither of them could ever win, and why the war went on so long without resolution. The prize they were both fighting for, the influence over Elizabeth, was also the person they both loved, and loving her meant that neither of them could press the conflict to the point of forcing her to choose, because forcing her to choose between her mother and her husband would have been a cruelty toward the one person both of them were trying to serve. So the war stayed cold. It stayed beneath the surface. It expressed itself in 1,000 small contests over names and houses and schools, and the running of the household, and the guiding of the Queen's instincts, and it never once broke into the open, because the open was forbidden by the love that both of them felt for the woman in the middle. Elizabeth spent her life as the contested ground between the two people closest to her, and she managed it, in her own way, by keeping a careful distance from both of them on the questions where they disagreed, by deferring to her mother on some things and her husband on others, by never quite letting either of them win completely. And the strain of being the prize in a 50-year contest between her mother and her husband is a strain she carried in silence, in the same way she carried everything, and that the public never saw. It is worth staying with Elizabeth for a moment, because she is the figure most easily lost in a story told as a duel between her mother and her husband, and she was not a bystander to the duel but its battlefield, and being a battlefield is its own particular kind of suffering. She had been raised, from her earliest childhood, in the discipline of self-suppression that the monarchy demands of its sovereigns, taught to subordinate her own feelings to her duty, to keep her counsel, to give nothing away, to be a surface on which the country could project whatever it needed to see. The training that made her such a successful queen made her, in the matter of her mother and her husband, almost helpless, because the only tool it had given her was the tool of containment, and containment was exactly the wrong tool for a conflict that could only have been resolved by someone willing to force a confrontation. She was not willing. She was incapable of it, constitutionally, in both senses of the word. So she did the thing she had been trained to do, which was to manage, to balance, to give each of them enough to prevent either from forcing the issue, and to absorb, in silence, the strain of being permanently pulled in two directions by the two people she loved most. She gave her mother the field of the surface, and the magic and the traditional warmth, deferring to her on the questions of how the monarchy should present itself and what it should feel like, because on those questions, her mother was the supreme authority, and Elizabeth trusted her completely. She gave her husband the field of the machine and the modernization and the practical running of things, deferring to him on the questions of how the institution should actually function, because on those questions he was right more often than not, and because she loved him and wanted him to have something that was genuinely his. And she kept the two fields carefully separate, so that her mother's authority and her husband's authority rarely had to meet head-on, so that the contest could continue indefinitely without ever being forced to a resolution that would have required her to choose. It was a masterpiece of management, and it held the family together for half a century, and it cost her something that she never spoke of, and that can only be inferred from the famous reticence that grew in her over the decades, the increasing reserve, the retreat into duty, the sense that there were vast areas of her inner life that she had simply sealed off because the alternative was unbearable. A woman pulled between her mother and her husband for 50 years, forbidden by her position from ever resolving the pull, learns to feel as little as she can, and Elizabeth learned that lesson early and practiced it for the rest of her life, and the reserve that the world admired as queenly dignity was, at least in part, the scar tissue of a daughter and a wife who had spent her whole life as the ground that two armies fought over. This was the genius and the horror of the conflict, that it could go on forever precisely because it was conducted by two people who loved the same woman and would not, for her sake, ever force the rupture that might have ended it. A war between two people who hate each other resolves, because hatred wants resolution, wants the enemy defeated and gone. A war between two people who love the same third person cannot resolve, because resolution would require hurting the person they both love, and so it stabilizes instead, settles into a permanent low condition that neither side can win and neither side will end, a chronic ache rather than an acute crisis. That is what the Queen Mother and Philip had. Not a feud that built toward a climax, but a climate that simply persisted, decade after decade, sustained by the very love that made it impossible to end. They were trapped in it together, the two of them, bound by the woman in the middle, into a contest that could never finish, and the only release either of them would ever get from it was death, and even death, when it came, would come to her first and leave him to carry the thing alone for 19 more years. There is an irony in all of this that the people involved were too close to it to see, and it is the irony that the monarchy itself was the beneficiary of the war that ran through its first family. An institution like the British monarchy needs two things that are in tension with each other. It needs to be magical, to maintain the surface and the warmth and the sense of continuity that makes people love it, because an institution that is merely functional inspires no devotion, and a monarchy that inspires no devotion is finished. And it needs to be functional, to reform and modernize and keep itself fit for a changing world, because an institution that is merely magical and refuses to change will eventually be overtaken by a world that has moved on without it. These two needs pull against each other. The magic resists change, because change disturbs the surface, and the function demands change, because the surface alone will not keep the thing alive. A healthy institution has to hold both at once, has to be magical and functional simultaneously, has to preserve and reform in the same motion, and holding both at once is extraordinarily difficult, because the two impulses are natural enemies. And the Windsor monarchy held both at once, across the second half of the 20th century, for a reason that nobody designed and nobody intended, which is that the two impulses were embodied in two people placed at the center of the same family, the Queen Mother holding the magic with everything she had, and Philip driving the function with everything he had, and the two of them pulling against each other across the life of the Queen produced, as the unintended sum of their opposition, very close to the balance the institution needed. The monarchy got its magic preserved because the Queen Mother fought for it. It got its machine modernized because Philip fought for it. And it got both at once because the two of them fought each other. To a permanent draw for 50 years. The war that divided the family was the thing that balanced the crown. Neither of them ever knew that they were, between them, doing the institution's most important work precisely by refusing to let the other win. And there is one more thing to be said in the honest accounting, one more complication that the simple story of the despising mother-in-law leaves out, and it has to do with what each of them actually got from the long contest, because the contest was not, in the end, a thing that one of them won and the other lost. It was a thing in which the prize itself was divided, and each of them got a different half of it, and the division tells you something about the limits of the Queen Mother's power that the rest of the story can obscure. The Queen Mother controlled the atmosphere. She shaped the surface, guided the instincts, embodied the tradition, won the dynastic battles, kept her preferred world intact, and outlasted, one by one, almost everyone who had ever opposed her. But there was one thing she never had and never could have, and Philip had it from the autumn of 1947 until the spring of 2021, and it was the thing that mattered most. He had Elizabeth. He had the marriage, the partnership, the shared life, the love of the woman they both wanted. In the ordinary daily intimate form that a husband has his wife, and that no mother-in-law, however formidable, can ever take or even touch. The Queen Mother could shape what Elizabeth thought about the monarchy. Philip was the man Elizabeth came home to. The Queen Mother won the institution. Philip won the woman. And in the long final accounting, across 54 years and 4 children and a partnership that became the steady center of the most watched family on earth, it is not at all clear that the Queen Mother got the better half of the bargain, however many of the visible battles she won. She had the crown's atmosphere. He had its queen. He may have understood, in the end, that this was the one victory she could never take from him, and it may have been the thing that allowed him to endure all the defeats she handed him, the knowledge that whatever she controlled, she did not control the marriage, and the marriage was the prize, and the prize was his. The decades that followed settled into a long, managed coexistence, the two of them growing old in the same family, attending the same occasions, performing the same unity, while the cold current ran beneath. There were thaws and there were frosts. There were periods when the family griefs drew everyone together and the old antagonisms receded, and periods when the old frictions sharpened over some new question of how the institution should respond to some new pressure. Through the difficult years of the 1970s and 80s, through the scandals and the marriages and the slow erosion of the deference the monarchy had once enjoyed, the Queen Mother and Philip continued their opposite projects, she preserving the magic and the warmth and the traditional surface, he pushing the institution toward whatever modernization the moment demanded, and the Queen continued to balance between them, and the family held together, more or less on the strength of the surface that both of them, for all their differences, were committed to maintaining. There was one death, in the middle of those decades, that touched the old antagonism in a way nothing else did, and it is worth dwelling on, because it shows how the long war between the Queen Mother and Philip ran even through the people they shared and the griefs they did not. In August of 1979, Louis Mountbatten, Philip's uncle, the man who had raised him and shaped him and engineered his marriage and stood behind him through everything, was killed by a bomb planted by the Irish Republican Army aboard his fishing boat off the coast of Sligo. The explosion killed Mountbatten, a 14-year-old grandson, a teenage local boy who worked on the boat, and an elderly relative, and it was one of the most shocking acts of violence the conflict in Ireland produced. For Philip, the loss was profound in a way that few of his losses were, because Mountbatten had been, in the most literal sense, the closest thing to a father he had ever had. The man who had given the homeless prince a direction and a future was gone, murdered, blown apart on a summer morning, and Philip's grief was real and deep and largely private, expressed in the controlled way he expressed everything, but unmistakable to the people who knew him. And here is the part that connects the death to the long war. Louis Mountbatten had been, for the entire span of the Queen Mother's adult life, one of the figures she trusted least and worked hardest to contain. She had distrusted him from the start. She had blocked his great dynastic ambition in the Name War of 1952. She had spent decades reducing his influence over the royal family, regarding his maneuvering and his self-promotion and his endless angling for advantage as a danger to the institution, and she had been remarkably successful at keeping him at the edge of real power, even as he remained a significant figure. Mountbatten was, in the long account of the Queen Mother's quiet campaigns, one of the people she had moved against, patiently and invisibly, across the years. And he was also the man Philip loved most in the world outside his own wife and children. So the murder of Mountbatten landed on the two of them in entirely different ways. To Philip it was the loss of his father, his mentor, his anchor, a wound that did not heal. To the Queen Mother it was the violent end of a man whose influence she had spent her life working to limit, and whatever genuine sorrow she felt at the manner of his death, and the manner of it was horrifying and would have moved anyone, the death itself removed from the board a figure she had never wanted on it. She did not rejoice. She was not that kind of woman, and the bomb that killed Mountbatten killed children too, and there is no version of her that took anything from that. But the loss that devastated Philip was, for the Queen Mother, the disappearance of an old adversary, and the gap between what the death meant to the husband and what it meant to the mother-in-law is as clean a measure as exists of how differently the two of them stood toward the same people and the same events across the long decades of their shared family. Philip would have known this. He always knew where she stood, even when she said nothing. He would have understood that the woman expressing her condolences at his uncle's funeral had been the most consistent obstacle to that uncle's ambitions for 30 years. That the grief he was carrying was for a man she had quietly opposed for longer than Philip had been British. And the knowledge would have sat there, unspoken, beneath the correct and decorous surface of a royal funeral, one more thing that could never be said. They buried Mountbatten with full ceremony, the family united in public mourning, the surface immaculate, and underneath the surface ran the truth that the two of them had always known about each other, that they had stood on opposite sides of every contest that mattered, including the contest over the very man whose coffin they were now following, and that the opposition would continue, as it always had, in silence, behind the smile. The decades wore on after that, and the antagonism settled into the deep background of two very old people who had been in each other's lives for so long that the original heat of the conflict had cooled into something more like a permanent climate. They saw each other constantly. The royal year is a fixed calendar of gatherings: Christmas at Sandringham, the summer at Balmoral, the endless cycle of official lunches and family occasions and ceremonial duties. And the Queen Mother and Philip moved through that calendar together for half a century, seated near each other at the same tables, photographed in the same groups, performing the same unity, year after year after year. The performance was, by this point, entirely automatic. Neither of them had to think about maintaining the surface anymore, because maintaining the surface had become as natural as breathing, a lifetime of practice on her side, and a lifetime of duty on his. They were courteous. They were correct. They were, on the occasions that called for it, even warm, because 50 years in the same family produces a kind of familiarity that is not affection exactly, but is not nothing either, the worn comfort of people who have known each other forever and have long since stopped expecting anything to change. And beneath the courtesy and the correctness and the worn familiarity, the old judgment held on her side and the old exasperation held on his, unchanged by the passing years, two convictions that had set in the 1950s and would not move now. The Queen Mother grew, over those decades, into the beloved figure of national affection that she had always been building toward, the nation's grandmother, the smiling and serene old lady with the gin and the horses and the wartime memories, and the public adored her, and almost none of them had any idea of the formidable intelligence and the iron will and the half-century of quiet campaigns that lay beneath the lavender. Philip grew, over the same decades, into the famously difficult and prickly figure the public came to know. The duke who said the wrong thing, the impatient and acerbic consort with the sharp tongue and the short temper, and a great deal of that prickliness, though the public never connected it to its source, was the accumulated residue of a man who had spent his entire adult life losing battles to opponents he could never bring into the open, of which his mother-in-law had been the first and the most consistent. The warm old lady and the difficult old man stood together in the family photographs, year after year, decade after decade, and the photographs showed unity, and the unity was real at the level of the surface and false at the level of everything underneath, which was exactly how the Queen Mother had always wanted the world to work. She died in March of 2002, at the age of 101, the longest-lived senior member of the royal family in its history, and the nation mourned her with a sincerity that few public figures ever earn. 200,000 people filed past her coffin, the image she had built across a century of public life, the warm and serene grandmother, held perfectly to the very end, undisturbed by the campaigns and the conflicts and the long Cold War with her son-in-law, none of which the public knew anything about. All of it preserved beneath the surface she had spent her life maintaining. And Philip, at her funeral, did what he had always done, which was perform the perfect public correctness, the dignity and the gravity appropriate to the death of the Queen's mother and the matriarch of the family, whatever he felt underneath. He outlived her. That is the part that the romantic story, with its assumption that the formidable Queen Mother always had the last word, tends to forget. She did not outlive him. He outlived her, by 19 years, dying in April of 2021, at the age of 99, 2 months short of his 100th birthday, having spent those final 19 years as the senior figure of the family she had left behind, the last survivor of his generation, the man who had walked into the institution as a penniless outsider she had judged unsuitable, and who had remained at its center for almost 3/4 of a century, longer than she had, longer than anyone. The 19 years that Philip lived after the Queen Mother died were, in a quiet way, the final movement of the long story, and they had a shape that the earlier decades did not. With her gone, the great opposing pole of his royal life was simply absent for the first time since 1947. The woman whose values had checked his at every turn, whose invisible hand he had felt behind every frustration, whose world he had spent half a century resisting, was no longer in the rooms, no longer at the tables, no longer shaping the atmosphere he moved through. And what is striking about those final years is that her absence did not feel, to the people who watched the family, like a liberation for Philip so much as the removal of a fixed point he had defined himself against for so long that its disappearance left a strange flatness. An old man who has spent 50 years in a particular opposition does not simply become free when the opposition ends. He becomes, in some sense, unmoored, because the thing he pushed against had become part of how he stood, and when it is gone, he is left pushing against nothing, balanced against an absence. He carried on, of course, in the way he carried on through everything, with the duty and the discipline and the refusal of self-pity that had defined him. He continued his work, his patronages, his decades-long projects, the modernizing instinct that had never left him. He stood beside Elizabeth through the long final phase of her reign, the two of them the last survivors of the world they had married into, the only two people left who remembered the beginning, who remembered Malta and the accession, and the name war, and the king who had died at Sandringham 70 years before. And in those final years, with the Queen Mother gone and the old battles settled into history, the marriage that had been the one prize she could never take revealed itself, more clearly than ever, as the thing the whole long story had really been about. Philip and Elizabeth grew old together. They had been married longer than any royal couple in the history of the country. They had built, out of the unpromising material of a contested wartime engagement, a partnership of such depth and steadiness that it became the still center around which the entire turbulent modern history of the family revolved. And the Queen Mother, for all her victories, had not been part of that. She had shaped the institution around the marriage. She had never been inside the marriage. The marriage was the one room she could not enter, and in the end it was the room where the real life happened, and Philip had lived in it for 73 years. When he died, he had outlived the Queen Mother by nearly 2 decades, and had become, in his very last years, an object of a public affection that would have astonished the establishment that once dismissed him. The penniless outsider, the man whose sisters could not attend his wedding, whose name was struck from the succession, who walked 2 steps behind his wife for 70 years and was told he could not give his name to his own children, had become, by the end, one of the most respected figures in the country, admired for exactly the qualities the old guard had once held against him: the bluntness, the refusal of cant, the practical intelligence, the steel. The reforms he had fought for had become the ordinary common sense of the institution. The modernization he had been obstructed on had become part of what helped the monarchy survive into a century that would have buried a purely magical version of it. He had been right about a great deal, and he had been proved right slowly, over decades, against the patient resistance of the world the Queen Mother embodied, and the proof had come too late for either of them to acknowledge it to the other. But it had come. What had it all been, in the end? Not the simple hatred the title promises, because the simple version is too small, and the people involved were too complicated for it. It had been a 54-year conflict of conviction between 2 people of genuine seriousness who loved the same woman and the same institution, and disagreed at the deepest level about what both of them required, conducted entirely beneath a surface that both of them were committed to keeping unbroken, and producing, in the strange way that opposed forces sometimes produce, a kind of balance that served the monarchy better than either of them serving alone would have done. The Queen Mother's wariness of Philip never softened into the open warmth of a mother-in-law who had finally accepted her daughter's husband, because she never did fully accept him, because the things about him that had alarmed her in 1947, the foreignness, the directness, the reforming energy, the influence of the Mountbatten interest behind him, were the same things that continued to alarm her for the rest of her life, and her alarm was sincere, and sincere alarm does not soften. And Philip's exasperation with her never resolved into the easy affection of a son-in-law who had finally come to appreciate the grand old lady, because the things about her that had infuriated him from the start, the extravagance, the evasion, the sentimentality, the invisible hand behind every atmosphere that frustrated him, were the same things that continued to infuriate him for the rest of her life, and his exasperation was sincere too, and they were both, in their sincerity, correct about each other. She thought he was a threat to the surface that kept the monarchy alive, and she was right, he was. He thought she was a threat to the machine that kept the monarchy functioning, and he was right too, in his way. They were 2 true things that could not be reconciled, placed in the same family, and they could not be reconciled because they were both true, and the conflict between them was not a failure of either of them, but the natural and permanent friction between 2 genuine and opposite goods. The monarchy needed the magic she preserved. It needed the modernization he forced. It got both of them because the 2 people who provided them spent 50 years pulling against each other across the body of the woman they both loved, and the woman in the middle held, and the institution held, and the surface held, and the public, looking at the smiling old lady and the difficult old man, never saw any of it. So the word in the title, despise, has to be handed back, gently, as the wrong word for the thing it tries to name. She did not despise him in the way that small people despise, with heat and spite and the wish to see the other brought low. What she felt toward him was colder than spite and more durable than hatred, and it was, in its way, more serious, because it was rooted not in personal dislike, but in a genuine and considered judgment about what the institution needed and what he threatened. She had looked at him across the length of half a century and concluded, again and again, that he was the wrong kind of man for the thing he had married into, and she had acted on the conclusion with a consistency that never wavered and never announced itself, and the acting on it shaped his life and her life and the life of the woman between them. That is not the operatic loathing the title promises. It is something quieter and harder, and, in the end, sadder. Because it was never going to change, and both of them knew it was never going to change, and they lived alongside the unchangeable fact of it, in the same family, for 54 years, with perfect courtesy, giving nothing away. And Philip, for his part, did not despise her either, whatever the frustration of decades of losing to her might have justified. He found her maddening, extravagant, evasive, the embodiment of everything he thought was wrong with the old way of doing things, and he was right about a fair amount of it, and his being right never won him a single one of the arguments that mattered while she was alive. But underneath the exasperation there was something that the long-shared decades produced, whether either of them willed it or not, a kind of grudging recognition between two people who had been adversaries for so long that the adversity had become a form of intimacy, the strange closeness of opponents who know each other better than friends do because they have spent 50 years studying each other for weaknesses. He understood her completely. She understood him completely. Neither of them ever liked what they understood. And they went on, year after year. In the understanding and the not liking, two of the most formidable people the institution ever produced, locked into a contest that neither could win and neither would end, until she was gone, and then he carried it alone, and then he was gone too, and the woman who had stood between them, the one they had both loved and both fought over, outlived them both by a little more than a year, and took whatever she knew of the truth of it with her into a silence, as complete as the surface the three of them had maintained for so long. The smile covered it. The smile had always covered everything. It covered the campaigns against her 6 enemies, and it covered the extravagance and the debts, and it covered, for 54 years, the long, cold current that ran between her and the husband of the daughter she loved more than anything in the world. She smiled at him at the family gatherings, and she smiled at him in the photographs, and she smiled at him across the decades, and the smile gave him nothing to fight, and that was the whole secret of her, the warmth that was also a weapon, the surface that was also a wall, the affection that concealed the judgment underneath. She had judged him unsuitable in 1947, and she had spent the rest of her life acting on the judgment without ever once stating it, and he had spent the rest of his life feeling the judgment and never being able to make her admit it. That is not hatred exactly. It is something rarer and harder and more interesting than hatred. It is conviction, maintained for 50 years behind a smile, and it is considerably more interesting than the lavender suggests. It is considerably more interesting than the lavender. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.